Well, the organisers here have curated perhaps the most extensive collection of 8Cs ever seen together in the UK, of which this is a wonderful example, many more examples alongside the fence there. Now, the 8C 2300 is regarded by automotive connoisseurs as probably the finest pre-war sports car, a legendary design that's talked about in the same breath as the Ferrari 250 GTO and also the McLaren F1. Undoubtedly one of the greatest motor cars ever produced. It's got looks, performance, versatility, and they enjoyed incredible success on the racetrack in the 1930s, and the road-going versions were simply the fastest and best cars of the time, competing against the very best offerings from Bugatti, from Maserati, and from Mercedes. Conceived in 1930 by Vittorio Jano, the brilliant Torinese engineer, it was a development of his giant-killing 6C 1750 Classic. The thoroughbred 8C featured a new supercharged straight 8 that pushed performance into another league. Powered by a 2.3 litre and 2.9 litre straight 8 cylinder engine with twin overhead camshafts designed by Vittorio Jano, whom Enzo Ferrari, by the way, had poached from Fiat. It's a wonderful car.
So beautiful, Steve, and as you rightly say, I mean, not only is you've got body from Zagato and from Turin and Castagna as some of the greatest of that period, but it's the engine on this car which is, for me, phenomenal. As I say, it was developed originally from the 6C 1750 as well as the P2 and the P3 racing cars. But they were essentially single-seaters, and what Alfa did with the P3 is they built a car that could be both raced on the track and driven on the roads, and of course in the road events of the day, like the Targa Florio and the Mille Miglia and Le Mans, but we'll come to that in a moment. But the engine, it's a straight 8 cylinders in a row, but what's quite interesting is actually comprises, Steve, and I'm hoping we can see it on the screen in a moment. The cameraman is kindly going to draw that to our attention. It's two 4-cylinder blocks mated end to end, and in the middle, for those of you that are not technical, all of the valve gear, all of the engine timing is driven from the crankshaft and from gears, etc. So that's in the middle of the engine, and it's divided into two 4-cylinder blocks, making 8 in line. It has it's all aluminium, which of course gives it a lighter weight. And the power was boosted by a Roots-type supercharger. In fact, the supercharger was really invented by Roots. They were one of the first people to pioneer that technology. And for those that don't know, I mean, you've heard of turbocharging cars, and turbocharging, supercharging, blower, they all do essentially the same thing, which is to run a car quickly, you need the perfect mixture of air and fuel. And in doing so, if you want to go... Hello, Aston Martin. I think you're due up later. Anyway, we're talking a little bit technical, but to make cars go quicker, essentially what you need to do is get as much fuel and air into the combustion chambers as quickly as you possibly can. And what a supercharger or a turbocharger does is it forces the air. So it's essentially a compressor, forcing the air and fuel mixture into the combustion chambers to make sure that these things have enough to drink when they're going quickly. The only difference between a supercharger and a turbocharger is that a turbocharger is driven by the exhaust, whereas the superchargers in this case are driven by the crankshaft. 188 Alfa 8Cs were built in total in various forms. This is obviously one of the, well, they're all beautiful, so we're not going to single out any particular examples. But this is a Zagato, and this is a Monza with bodywork by the factory, or in some cases by Zagato. And as I said before, while the P2 and P3 out-and-out race cars were single-seaters, these were two-seat cars, but they could be used in Grand Prix racing as well. So what they would do is they would take the headlights off, get rid of the spare wheels, and they would have or take the wings off altogether. This car was probably born with cycle wings, so more similar in fact to the green car that's just behind you there. So just minimal wings covering the wheels, and they're very easy to remove, meaning that you could drive these cars on the Grand Prix circuits of the day, because at the time road cars could also be driven in Grand Prix. These cars were raced by, we've talked about Italian names and the great sounding names. You've got Alfa Romeo 8C, but driven by people like Tazio Nuvolari, Clement Biondetti, Giuseppe Campari, Giuseppe Farina. And then, of course, Earl Howe and Tim Birkin, British drivers. And the 8C, in fact, achieved its legendary status by, in 1931 and 1932 and 1933, winning both Grand Prix, the Le Mans 24 Hours, and the Mille Miglia in the same year. A really fantastic feat, and just showing the versatility of these cars. In 1931 and 32, Tazio Nuvolari won the Targa Florio, which was a very, very grueling road race. But not just that, the 8Cs won Le Mans 24 Hours. We're going to talk about Bentley a bit later, and Bentley being famous for winning Le Mans in the 1920s. Alfa Romeo came along in 1931, 32, 33 and 34 and won Le Mans outright, the 24-hour race in France. But what's quite interesting in that, the winner in 1931 was in fact an English team, a pairing of Tim Birkin and Lord Howe, Earl Howe. So that's quite interesting, the fact that it was a British team that went from Bentley, drove an Alfa Romeo and won at Le Mans. They were more based on the long chassis cars. We will be looking at it a bit more in detail, but Mihai has kindly bought his touring body long chassis. And of course, to race in Le Mans in that period, you had to have 4-seat bodywork to race these cars. So it was based on a long chassis with a 4-seat style body. And as you can see, it's got a tonneau cover covering the rear. But in order to get entry to Le Mans, you had to have a body style which suited. So, Steve, 90 years on, these cars are coveted by collectors. And as you rightly say, all of the top collectors in the world want to have an 8C.
Absolutely, the Alfa Romeo 8C, 90 years on. I don't know whether you can come to the fence and just tell us a little bit about your car in particular, but tell us more about this Monza, which has come up in front of the stage here.
Well, Steve, this is this car, in fact, won at Salon Privé last year. It's owned by Ian Livingstone, a well-known collector. It's an early works car, which was registered to Scuderia Ferrari on the 21st of July in 1932. And the Monza name comes from the fact that the Alfa Romeo 8C won the Monza Grand Prix in 1931 and driven by Nuvolari and Campari. I just love the sound of those names. And as I said before, these are the days where you could actually take a road car, take the wings off, the lights off, the spare wheels, and you could drive it on a Grand Prix circuit. But something you may also notice, which you'll see on modern Ferraris today, but this is the origins of it. You'll see the Scuderia Ferrari shields with the Cavallino Rampanti. That indicates that this was a car from the Scuderia Ferrari. And Enzo Ferrari himself had in fact been a Grand Prix driver, and he was racing and looking after the racing team for Alfa Romeo. But he'd been in a race in 1923 and was spotted by Count Enrico Baracca and Countess Paolina Baracca, who were the parents of the famous flying ace Francesco Baracca, who was a pilot during World War I. He was shot down, I believe, and killed in 1918. But they knew Enzo, they'd seen how well he'd done in the race. And this, in fact, the Cavallino Rampanti was part of their family crest, the Black Horse. And they invited Enzo, they said, why don't you put the Black Horse, the Cavallino Rampanti, on your racing cars? It will bring you luck. And he decided to do that. But the yellow shield, in fact, was something that Enzo Ferrari added himself, yellow being the colour of Modena. So that's quite an interesting story when you see the cars wearing the Scuderia Ferrari emblem there. So this car has been raced by none other than Tazio Nuvolari, the flying Mantuan, lantern jawed, tight t-shirt, cigarette smoking, leather flying helmet, just the archetypal racing driver.
Those were the days.
What, did you used to do that too, Steve?
Well, yeah, the cigars anyway.
But it raced very successfully for the Scuderia Ferrari up until 1934 when it was sold to England. And then it remained in a very large collection for many years, 60 plus years, with Michael Crowley Millin, who in fact, this is quite a nice part of the story, received this car as a 21st birthday present, before later, some 60 years later, selling it to the present owner. So a really important car, and I think these cars, long chassis, short chassis, Zagato, Touring, long wings, cycle wings, beautiful.
Shall we keep him talking a bit longer, see if he knows any more about the 8C, or have you done? Let's bring on Mihai.
Got 90 years of history.
Actually drives one. Mihai, come on to the front of the stage. You got the long wheelbase version there, just on the other side of the fence. Tell us about that car in particular, first of all.
So this car is almost from new British-owned car. It was imported in '37 to Brooklands, who at that moment was the importer. They're called Thompson and Taylor. It's a, well, matching numbers car. The body is slightly different than it would have been back in the day because it lost its original body in 37 when they wanted to update it to a slightly later, more modern body. So we've backdated it. Yeah, I mean the long chassis cars, short chassis cars. I don't know. Anyone who's known with Land Rovers maybe knows that the 90s will be a lot more bumpy and less stable than the long chassis cars. So with Alfas, it's quite similar. The long chassis cars are a lot more relaxed on the road. That's why we chose to buy a long chassis car. I don't know what else you really...
Tell us a bit about the experience of driving. You drove it here today through some of the worst weather this morning, and tell us about the experience of driving it.
So, well, the Alfas, as we know, they were made with an almost unlimited government budget, so they were incredibly advanced for the time. So when people ask me, like, what is it like to drive, I would say that it's easily on par with most 50s to even late 50s sports cars. I'm quite happy to also be able to drive vintage Bentleys, which in comparison to the Alfas are really agricultural and old-fashioned. So yeah, they're incredibly easy to drive. I would even say it's one of the better cars to learn how to double declutch and deal with all the things that come with driving vintage cars, to then move on to other cars like the Bentleys, which are people say either you get it almost instantly or you'll never be able to drive one, because it once you miss a gear, you stop at the side of the road, go to neutral and start over again, type of job.
I know that feeling, but the interesting thing is, I mean, we're talking about that, and I was going to mention it later, Steve, but the thing about these cars is when you do get that double D-clutch, down change, right, it's the snicker that you get from hitting that driver, that lovely sound, it's right.
I've never had that either, but tell us about 90 years of the 8C. Is there a bit of a community among the owners? Do you get together at things like this? Do you know what else is around you in this respect?
Yeah, because there's such specialized cars, there's only a handful of people who can take care of them. So you end up going to the same restorers, the same people to maintain them. There's a good community. There's a thing called the 8C Rally, where they try and get as many together on a rally. I think the last one was in Switzerland.
Quite possibly, yeah.
Yeah. So it is a quite close-knit community. Yeah.
It's interesting, me, how you said that they're quite easy to drive, and the one thing that most people should be aware before driving an 8C is where the throttle is placed.
Yeah, so on most vintage performance cars, it's a center throttle. Not really sure why maybe you know why they did that, but
I don't, but I think the expression heel and toe probably was coined in the days when it was a center throttle.
Yeah, because I'm starting to do some historic racing now, and I've got a lot of time behind the wheel of vintage cars. So heel and towing I'm learning in a Lotus Cortina. Learning to heel and tow the other way now is proving to be quite challenging.
Let's just enjoy that for a moment.
Am I right? This is the 1933 8C Monza FYE 7.
That's the one.
The first Monza to come to the UK. What a great sound it makes. It's very distinctive, isn't it, Miguel?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, this was bought in 1933 by Noel Rees, who was a self-made housing developer and race entrant as well. Campaigned by the Honourable Brian Lewis at Brooklands, where first time out it won the International Trophy at Brooklands. One in the Isle of Man, it was painted green to race abroad, and entries had to be painted in the national colour of the driver at that time, and it's coming up in front of the stage now. Amazing succession of famous owners, including the Land Speed record legend John Cobb was an owner. 1935 Le Mans winner Louis Fontes, who made his name with Monza by winning the 1934 International Trophy. After the war, it was painted red, road equipped by the trade, and the honorary Patrick Lindsay, the famous collector and historic racer, ran it as his company car whilst heading the Old Masters department at Christie's. That is class, isn't it?
I mean, it's just spectacular, isn't it, Steve? I mean, just look at those two together. And again, it highlights some of the differences. And this is probably, it's been the Monza version. You can see the radiator grille had this cowl around it with the cooling. That shows you that it's a Monza. That was the way that they kept those engines cool, but also not too much air going through, so they warmed up nice and quickly as well. But the fact that it has the cycle wings rather than the swoop-in wings, and the external exhaust, of course, which sounds rather fruity, I have to say. Roderick, it's so good of you to bring it up and to drive it up, and thank you for waiting patiently. You've had this car for some time, I believe.
Yeah, around 10 years.
And what was it? Was an Alfa 8C on your wish list for many years, and you were just waiting for the moment to pounce when the right car came along, or was it serendipity in any other way?
Very much serendipity. I'm embarrassed to say I had a phone call from somebody who told me I had to own this car. This is the British 8C, the British Monza, and it had been out of the country for about 20 years. And somebody who knew me thought I should buy this car. Luckily, I was, first of all, extremely lucky to be offered the opportunity to buy it, and secondly, to be able to buy it. And it's really a remarkable machine.
And its history and heritage is what's it makes it stand out. I mean, tell us about the owners who have cherished this car. Patrick Lindsay in particular seemed to have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, Patrick was an extraordinary character. I don't feel qualified to describe him in any way that would do full justice to him. Head auctioneer at Bonhams. I don't know if you already mentioned it or not, but he would regularly turn up to auctions in a Spitfire. He raced this car an awful lot. He raced another very famous ERA called Remus, even more, and really had an extraordinary life with this car. But the true era for this car was the early 30s. It did extraordinary things. It won at Brooklands multiple times. It won in the Isle of Man. It won in Ireland. And it's hard to imagine for any of these 8Cs, it's hard to imagine what it was like to see one of these cars in an era where every other car had top speeds of 30, 40 miles an hour. These were cars that had top speeds of 130, 140 miles an hour, and even by modern day standards, this is an exceptionally quick car. So if you put that in the context of the 30s, it's very hard to imagine.
And it's also easy to overlook the fact that in modern Grand Prix racing, you talk about Mercedes, you talk about McLaren, you talk about Ferrari, but Alfa Romeo were the bedrock of Grand Prix racing. They were the standard, pre-war and post-war, early 50s.
Yes, I mean, Alfa from the late 20s until the mid-30s, until the Germans came along with Auto Union and Mercedes, the Alfas won everything, and Monzas and 8Cs dominated the Mille Miglia, they dominated the Targa Florio. They won more Grand Prix than any other cars in the mid-30s, so they were undoubtedly the most competitive. And these cars were still really competitive into the immediate post-war period as well. So yes, it was the dominant brand in racing for a long time.
Steve, what I think is fascinating about that, I mean, Steve, you've been around the Grand Prix circuits a few times, but can you imagine Lewis Hamilton's McLaren doing a 1,000-mile race down to Rome again on back on unmade roads, or the Targa Florio, and then competing in a Grand Prix, and then at Le Mans? I mean, it's just staggering that these cars were just so versatile and could do so much.
I can't imagine Lewis Hamilton driving a 1,000-mile race on unmade roads, let alone his McLaren or his Mercedes or whatever he might be driving. The driving experience for you, though, Roderick, is what?
It's absolutely astonishing. I've done 2 or 3 Mille Miglias in this car. I've driven several thousand miles in the Highlands of Scotland. I'm going there again next week. This car's going to Goodwood to the Festival of Speed this coming weekend, and then we'll go to Scotland. And I've done thousands and thousands of miles. My long-suffering wife who loves the car but has to sit on the slightly smaller passenger seat and right next to the open exhaust, has also spent thousands of miles in this car. And it's exceptionally loud, it's exceptionally fast, it has tremendous torque, the engine has amazing torque, and essentially, it's a classic wind in the hair experience. I mean, it's really, there's nothing like it.
But is that a happy experience, driving in Scotland in August and all the caravans on the road and, twisty turn back?
We're about to find out. In truth, we normally go in September, October. This is July. We'll find out how the staycation has, what it's done for the Highland driving.
You will blow them away. But this car needs to be driven for pleasure. It needs to be driven in anger, doesn't it? It needs to be used as a car to enjoy.
Well, I think as well, Steve, I mean, you're talking about the driving experience, which nobody knows better than Roderick, but they were sophisticated, I think. I mean, in driving a Bentley or even a Bugatti, as quick as they were, there was something about this engine, the straight 8, smooth power, the supercharger was extremely sophisticated, and their use of it and the way they designed it, because you can't just bolt a supercharger on the side and hope it's going to work. You have to think about its placement. I was talking to the man, Jim Stokes, earlier, just about the engineering behind the supercharger and just getting that, the fuel dripping being pushed into there and then all forced down the combustion chambers, just the right amount. It's crucial. And they got it right with this car. And it's not a big capacity car. It grew to 2.9 litres, and that was also raced. And again, one thing we haven't mentioned is the Bimotore. And that was a Grand Prix car, which unfortunately didn't have a happy ending, and it's since been recreated. And that actually we've talked about 2 engine blocks together, end to end. That had 2 8C engines, one in the front, one in the rear. And Alan de Cadenet famously drove it around Lord Bamford's circuit and made a film about it. Absolutely wonderful. If you have a chance to look at that on YouTube, look it up. Alan de Cadenet in the Bimotore. It's just wonderful. So they weren't happy with the 160 horsepower from this. They doubled it by putting another engine in. That was classic engineering.
Well, thanks for bringing it here. I mean, this feels like the perfect preparation for the festival next weekend and Scotland after. Thank you very much. Cheers, Roderick, and what a wonderful car.